Well, this is continuing in our studies in Hebrews and coming on to what in actual fact might be quite a difficult chapter. I would remind you that in Hebrews I'm actually using the New International Version only because I'm finding that the language is a bit clearer than in the Orthodox, although I prefer the authorized version. Anyway, moving on from what I was saying last time, we're dealing with quite a number of legal issues because this book is written to the Hebrews. And so it's relating much more directly, and in most of the references you will find quite clearly that it is more applicable to understand when you see it from a Jewish perspective. So, at the end of verse 6, we did come up to the question of Melchizedek. And in chapter 7, now we do have to basically spend this chapter on dealing with who Melchizedek was and what the significance is. Now, it says, Paul says quite clearly, Melchizedek was a king. He was king of Salem, and most people would believe that that meant Jerusalem. He was also a priest of God. So Melchizedek is identified with two things, king and priest. And it's quite interesting, before we actually go into this with Melchizedek, that we are described as believers, as both kings and priests. So here, for the first time in the scripture, in reference to the Old Testament, do you get this joint position of king and priest. And it says in this opening part, he met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. And Abraham gave him 1/10 of everything. Now, this is extremely unusual. And it's unusual in the sense that it's mentioned here in the New Testament, in Paul's writings. And therefore, we have to look at Paul's writings and realize that there was a special significance in everything he's dealing with. And so let's have a look and see if we can find out why. He met Abraham after Abraham had defeated the kings, and Melchizedek blessed Abraham. And not only did he bless him, but Abraham gave him 1/10 of everything. Now, we need to have a look at this tenth because under the Jewish law, it was the Levites, the priests, who, coming from Aaron and from Levi, that tribe, who, in order to live, because they were set aside for the worship of the temple, did receive 1/10 from the others. So it's quite significant here. It's not just the priests, it's here Melchizedek is given the same. And if you look at the name Melchizedek, it is also significant because the name Melchizedek means, Paul says, King of Righteousness. So his name means King of Righteousness, and also his position is King of Salem, which means King of Peace. Salem is peace. So the next thing that comes out is very clearly that And you have to understand this, that Paul says that he had no father, no mother, no genealogy, and was without beginning of days or end of days. So, in other words, he is not, in the normal sense of human descendancy, that he had no father or mother, he had no genealogy, he had no beginning of days and no end of days. So, this is where Paul sums it up when he says, like the Son of God. Because the only other person in the whole of Scripture, the whole of the Bible, there's only one other person who has no beginning and no ending besides God himself, and that is Jesus himself. So we're really entering into quite something here. Now, in verse 4 it says, look how great this Melchizedek was. Even Abraham, who was a patriarch, Abraham, who was the very founder of the race, gave to Melchizedek the 10th. Now, it wasn't Melchizedek giving to Abraham, but Abraham acknowledging that Melchizedek was greater than he was, because the greater doesn't give to the lesser gives to the greater. This is very interesting. And then in verse 5 it explains this. Now the law requires the descendants of Levi, who became priests, to collect a tenth from the people. That's just from their brothers, even though their brothers are descended from Abraham. So this man in verse 6, Melchizedek, did not trace his descent from Levi, yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him. And yet he was blessing Abraham, who had the promise. You see, if you go back into the previous chapter 6, verse 13, God made his promises to Abraham. And it actually says in this 13th verse of chapter 6, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, he swore by himself, that is God, saying, surely I will bless you and give you many descendants. And so Abraham received what was promised. So it is quite significant that here, what it's saying in chapter 7, verse 6, is that Melchizedek, who had no record of his genealogy, yet collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him, Abraham, who had the promises.